The cantina's air hung thick with smoke from a dozen different worlds. Neon lights flickered in shades of blue and green, casting strange shadows across the metal walls. In the darkest corner, where the light barely reached, sat a figure that most patrons avoided. Commander Vextel had been nursing the same mug of bitter ale for 3 hours. His 6-fingered hands, each digit ending in razor-sharp claws, gripped the metal container with enough force to leave permanent dents. The old Catharian's scaled hide was a roadmap of violence. Ritual scars from 20 campaigns crisscrossed his chest and arms like a warrior's tapestry. Each mark told a story of blood and victory, of worlds conquered and enemies crushed. But his eyes told a different story. Once bright yellow orbs that had gleamed with predatory hunger now seemed dimmed, weighed down by memories that refused to fade. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, sensing the darkness that surrounded him like a cloud. The cantina door hissed open, and a group of young soldiers stumbled in, their laughter cutting through the smoky atmosphere. They were fresh recruits from the Galactic Coalition Academy, their uniforms still pressed to perfection. Their weapons polished to a mirror shine. A Zephyrian with translucent wings folded against his back led the group, followed by a hulking Centauri whose forearms gestured wildly as he told some joke. Behind them came a pair of hegemony twins, their blue skin marked with the traditional tattoos of their homeworld. They carried themselves with the swagger of those who had never seen real combat, never felt the burn of plasma fire, or heard the screams of dying comrades. Their eyes sparkled with excitement and dreams of glory. "Look at that old lizard," one of the hegemony twins whispered, nodding toward Vextel's corner. "Bet he's got some stories." "I heard he fought in the human wars," the Zephyrian lieutenant said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "Say he was there when the Catharian Empire tried to conquer the Sol system." The Centauri's eyes widened. The human wars. Those were legendary battles, the stuff of holovids and war games. Their chatter grew louder, fueled by alcohol and youthful bravado. Finally, the Zephyrian worked up the courage to approach the corner. Booth's companions followed, forming a semicircle around the old warrior's table. "Commander," the Zephyrian lieutenant spoke first, his voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "We've heard stories about the human wars. The glorious battles, the heroic charges, the glorious—" Vextel's voice cut through their chatter like a plasma blade through flesh. The word dripped with contempt and something else. Pain, perhaps, or regret. His yellow eyes fixed on the young officer with an intensity that made the Zephyrians' wings flutter nervously. "You want glory? Find a holovid. They're full of lies that won't give you nightmares." He turned away, dismissing them with a gesture. But the recruits had come too far to back down now. Centauri stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. "Please, sir, we're shipping out tomorrow to patrol the Outer Rim. Human space. Command says we need to understand what we're dealing with. The briefings don't tell us much." At the word human, something changed in Vextel's posture. His grip tightened on his mug until the metal creaked under the pressure. His claws extended, slightly scraping against the surface with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Humans," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the cantina's din. The words seemed to hang in the air like a curse. "You think you know what humans are? You think your academy training prepared you for them?" His laugh was bitter, hollow, the sound of something broken trying to find humor in tragedy. "I spent 10 years fighting them, 10 years learning what they really are. And you know what I discovered? Everything we were told was wrong. Everything." Recruits exchanged glances. This wasn't the war story they'd expected. Where were the tales of Catharian superiority? Where were the accounts of human cowardice and weakness? "Sit down, younglings," Vextel said, his voice taking on a different tone. Not the harsh bark of a commander, but something softer, more dangerous. "Let me tell you what I learned in 10 years of war. Let me tell you why I wake up screaming. Their names." The recruits hesitated for a moment, then slowly took their seats around the table. The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very air sensed the weight of the story about to be told. Vextel stared into his drink, but his eyes saw something else entirely. Not the foam on bitter ale, but the ash of burning worlds. Not the amber liquid, but the blood of fallen comrades. Not the reflection of neon lights, but the faces of humans who had died with his name on their lips. It started on Kepler 44 to B, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a funeral dirge. Small agricultural world in the outer colonies. Population, 3,000 humans, mostly farmers and their families. Our intelligence said it would be an easy target. Minimal defenses, obsolete weapons, no military presence. He paused, taking a long drink from his mug. The recruits leaned forward, hanging on his every word. He called it an easy target. He continued, his voice growing darker. We were wrong about that. We were wrong about everything. The first drop pods hit Kepler 442b's atmosphere like falling stars, their heat shields glowing white-hot against the pale morning sky. Vextel stood on the command deck of the dreadnought Bonecrusher, watching the invasion unfold through the massive viewing ports. The ship's hull stretched 4 kilometers in both directions, bristling with weapons capable of cracking planets in half. Target acquired, sir, his weapons officer reported, mandibles clicking with excitement. Shall we begin orbital bombardment? Negative, Vextel replied, studying the tactical display. Intelligence wants prisoners and intact infrastructure. We go in clean ground assault only. The planet below looked peaceful from orbit. Rolling green fields stretched between scattered settlements, irrigation channels glinting like silver threads in the sunlight. Farming vehicles moved slowly through the crops, their drivers probably unaware that death was falling from the sky. First wave is touching down now, the communications officer announced. Minimal resistance encountered. Local defense grid is offline. Vexel nodded with satisfaction. His aide, a young Catherian named Torvak, pulled up the mission parameters on a holographic display. Intelligence estimates total human population at 3,000. Mostly agricultural workers, some light industry, basic defensive systems, obsolete weapons. Estimated resistance time. 4 hours maximum. 4 hours, Vexel repeated, already planning the next phase of the campaign. Have the second wave ready for immediate deployment once the settlement is secured. But for hours. Past, then 8, then 12. The tactical display showed something that made no sense. His assault forces were being held up by farmers with hunting rifles, down on the planet's surface. Captain Hansel Kim crouched behind a makeshift barricade of overturned farming equipment. His rifle was cracked down the middle, held together with industrial tape and prayer. His uniform, once the crisp blue of the Colonial Defense Force, now hung in tatters, stained with dirt and blood. A jagged scar ran from his left temple, too. His jaw, a souvenir from the first day's fighting, but his eyes still burned with defiance. Status report, he called to his second-in-command. Ducking as plasma fire scorched the air above his head, Lieutenant Sora Park crawled over, her face streaked with soot. Ammunition at 12%, sir. Food stores depleted 3 days ago. Medical supplies. She paused, looking at the improvised bandages wrapped around her arm. We've been using furniture fabric for bandages for 3 weeks. Hansel nodded grimly. Round them, the defenders of New Busan went about their deadly work with grim efficiency. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, mechanics, shopkeepers. People who had never held a weapon in anger before the Catherians came. But they moved with the practiced coordination of a veteran unit. Old Mrs. Chen, who had taught mathematics for 40 years, now calculated firing solutions for their improvised artillery. Her granddaughter, barely 12 years old, ran ammunition. Between positions with the fearlessness of youth, former mechanic Dongwu Park had turned the settlement's maintenance. Tunnels into a network of supply routes and ambush points. Sir, called Private Taemin Lee from the eastern watchtower, enemy formation approaching. Looks like another probe attack. Hansel raised his binoculars, scanning the horizon. The Catherian assault mechs moved across the scorched earth like metal insects, their articulated legs carrying them over the rubble of what had once been wheat fields. Behind them, the familiar bulk of Commander Vextel's command vehicle rumbled forward, its energy shields shimmering in the heat. Remember, Hansel called to his people, his voice carrying across the settlement, we're not just defending our home. Every day we hold out, every ship we destroy, gives Earth time to mobilize. Our families are counting on us. The Catherians came with overwhelming force. Plasma cannons lit up the morning sky like artificial lightning. The ground shook under the impact of explosive shells, but the humans were ready. What had once been crop irrigation systems now channeled explosive charges. Farming equipment had been converted into mobile weapons platforms. The grain silos that had once stored wheat now housed missile launchers, cobbled together from mining equipment and sheer determination. "Fire!" Hansal shouted. The response was immediate and devastating. Magnetic pulse weapons, jury-rigged from or extractors, sent waves of electromagnetic energy that scrambled the Catherian mech's targeting systems. Improvised explosives detonated in sequence, creating a chain reaction that sent 3 assault vehicles tumbling into craters that had been carefully prepared days in advance. From his command post, Vexthel watched in growing amazement as yet. Another assault wave was repelled. His tactical officer, a battle-scarred veteran named Krexther, turned to him with confusion written across his reptilian features. "Sir, we've lost 16 heavy assault mechs in the past hour. The humans are using some kind of advanced magnetic pulse weapon." "Impossible," Vexel replied. "They don't have that technology. Our intelligence was clear. Obsolete weapons only, sir. ... Krexther's voice carried a note of disbelief. "They're using their mining equipment. They've weaponized their ore extractors." As the siege dragged on, day after day, week after week, Vexel began to understand something that would change his view of warfare forever. These weren't soldiers he was fighting. They were ordinary people who had simply refused to surrender. When Corporal Minjuno lost both his legs to a plasma burst, he didn't retreat to the medical station. Instead, he had himself carried to the communications array and continued coordinating the defense from his stretcher. When Engineer the Jincho's workshop was destroyed in a bombardment, she didn't give up. She moved her operations to the sewers beneath the settlement and kept producing ammunition, using scavenged materials and tools she had built from scratch. "They're not fighting like soldiers," Vextel told his officers after the 200th day of the siege. "They're fighting like they have something to live for." The siege of Kepler 4-4 to be finally ended when the human Third Fleet arrived, a collection of ships that had traveled from Earth at maximum speed, their crews pushing the engines beyond safe limits. As the Catherian forces began their retreat, Vextel looked back at the burning settlement one last time. There, standing on the walls that had held for over 8 months, was Captain Hansal Kim. His rifle was finally broken beyond repair, but he stood at attention, saluting the evacuation ships that were carrying the survivors to safety. Even in defeat, even with his settlement in ruins, he maintained the dignity of a soldier. "That was my first lesson," Vextel told the recruits in the cantina, his voice heavy with memory. "Humans don't fight for conquest or glory, they fight for each other. And that makes them the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy." The Battle of Titan's Edge had started as a routine patrol sweep. Vextel's hunting pack 3 fast cruisers and a command ship had been tracking human supply convoys through the asteroid belt for weeks. The prey they found that day was perfect. A single medical frigate, lightly armed and far from any backup. Easy target, his tactical officer had reported with satisfaction. Medical ship, minimal escort, carrying wounded from the Centauri campaign. Vexel had nodded, watching the human vessel drift helplessly after their surprise attack had disabled its engines. The frigate was painted white with red crosses, the universal symbol of medical aid. But war was war, and wounded enemies could fight again if they healed. The boarding operation was swift and brutal. Catherian shock troops cut through the frigate's hull with plasma torches, pouring into the corridors like a metal tide. The ship's crew put up token resistance, but they were medics and nurses, not soldiers. Within minutes, the vessel was secured. When they found her, Dr. Gi Wu-song was barely with the soft features of someone who had spent her life healing rather than fighting. When the Catherian boarders smashed into the medical bay, she was hunched over an operating table, her hands deep inside a wounded soldier's chest cavity. Plasma fire erupted around her, scorching the walls and setting medical equipment ablaze. She didn't move. Human female. Step away from the patient, the squad leader barked in broken standard. Almost finished, she replied calmly, her voice steady despite the chaos. He's bleeding internally. If I stop now, he dies. The Catherian raised his weapon, but something in her tone made him hesitate. She wasn't pleading or cowering. She was simply stating a fact, like discussing the weather. You have 30 seconds, he growled. She worked in silence, her hands moving with practiced precision. Around her, other medical staff were being herded into the corridor at gunpoint. Equipment sparked and smoked from weapon impacts. But in that small bubble around the operating table, there was only the steady rhythm of life-saving work. Done, she said finally, stepping back. The soldier on the table was unconscious, but breathing steadily. She looked up at the Catherian squad leader and nodded. He'll live. You can take me now. Hours later, she was strapped to an interrogation chair in the detention center of Vextel S command ship. The neural extractor loomed above her like a mechanical spider, its probe arms extending toward her skull. Vextel watched from behind reinforced glass as the interrogation specialist prepared the equipment. Prisoner 2847, the specialist announced, his voice flat and professional. Human, female, medical officer. Standard neural extraction authorized. The neural extractor was a device that directly interfaced with the subject's brain, pulling memories and information with surgical precision. It was considered one of the most advanced interrogation tools in the galaxy, and also one of the most painful. Most species lasted 3 hours before their minds shattered completely. Please, Dr. Song said as the electrodes were attached to her skull, I can see some of your guards are injured. I have medical supplies in my kit, let me help them. The interrogator ignored her, activating the machine. The neural extractor hummed to life, sending waves of agony through her nervous system. Vextel expected screams, pleas for mercy, the usual breakdown that came with neural intrusion. Instead, she began to speak. The neural interface is causing microhemorrhages in your occipital lobe, she told her torturer, her voice strained but controlled. You need to reduce the frequency by 15% or you'll cause permanent brain damage. The interrogator looked up, confused. She's trying to manipulate the equipment, he reported to Vextel. No, Vextel realized with growing horror. She's trying to help us. Day after day, they tried to break her. They showed her holographic images of destroyed human colonies, the bodies of civilians scattered in the streets. They told her lies about her family's death, claimed her parents had been executed as traitors. They subjected her to psychological torture that had broken enemy. Agents within hours, Dr. Song endured it all while providing medical advice to her captors. Your species has a calcium deficiency, she told the guard who brought her water on the 3rd day. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, but her voice remained steady. The ridges on your carapace are showing stress fractures. You need to supplement your diet with mineral compounds. The guard stared at her, unsure how to respond. Here was a prisoner, tortured for days, offering medical advice to her captors. On the 4th day, she noticed the interrogator's hand shaking as he operated the neural extractor. The machine is damaging your brain too, she warned Vexel during one session. Neural feedback syndrome. The interface creates a sympathetic connection. Please, let me examine him. Vextel found himself actually considering it. There was something about her calm certainty, her absolute focus on healing, even in the face of torture, that shook him to his core. Why, he asked, stepping into the interrogation chamber for the first time. Why do you care what happens to us? Dr. Song looked up at him, and despite the pain etched in her features, her eyes held no hatred. Because you're in pain, she said simply. All of you. I can see it in your movements, in your body language. You're suffering, and I'm a doctor. It's what I do. The interrogator increased the machine's power, sending fresh waves of agony through her nervous system. She gasped, her body convulsing against the restraints, but she didn't break. The human homeworld, the interrogator demanded. What are their defensive capabilities? I don't know, she replied honestly. I'm a doctor. not a strategist, but I can tell you about their medical facilities. If you're planning an invasion, you should know they have the best trauma centers in the galaxy. It could help your wounded too. Even under torture, she was thinking about healing. On the 6th day, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red as the ship shuddered under weapons fire. Commander Donghyun Park had arrived with a rescue team, cutting through the Catherian ship's defenses with surgical precision. When they reached the detention center, they found Dr. Song still conscious, still defiant. Her body was broken. Her mind should have been shattered, but somehow she held on. "Gi Woo," Commander Park called out, his voice thick with emotion. "We're here to get you out." "Wait," she said, struggling to sit up as the rescue team cut her free. "There are wounded Catherians in the medical bay. I promised I'd check on them." The rescue team stared at her in disbelief. She had been tortured for 6 days, had revealed nothing. Her first concern was for her captors. As they evacuated, Dr. Song left behind a medical kit with detailed notes on treating Catherian physiology. In case they need it, she explained to the dumbfounded guards. That night, as his ship limped back to base, Vextel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what she'd said, about the calcium deficiency, about the neural feedback. She had been trying to heal them even as they tried to break her. "I realized that day," Vextel told the recruits in the cantina, his voice barely above a whisper, "that we weren't fighting soldiers. We were fighting angels." The neutron star Charybdis spun in the darkness like a cosmic lighthouse, its radiation sweeping across space in deadly beams. Omega Station hung in its shadow, a massive structure of metal and glass that had taken decades to build. It was the lifeline of the outer colonies, a supply hub where ships from 100 worlds came to refuel and restock. Now it was about to become a tomb. Vextel stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the station grow larger on the main display. Behind him, the greatest armada the Catherian Empire had ever assembled waited for his command. 10,000 shock troops spread across 50 warships, their weapons charged and ready. This was supposed to be the final blow, the strike that would end human resistance in the Outer Rim. "Sir, we're in position," his tactical officer reported. "All boarding craft ready to launch." Through the viewports, Vextel could see the civilian. Evacuation ships docked at the station like metal moths around a flame. Cargo vessels, passenger liners, even old mining ships, anything that could carry people away from the coming battle. Thousands of non-combatants were being loaded onto those ships, their lives hanging in the balance. To open a channel to the station, Vextel ordered. The communication system crackled to life, and suddenly he was face to face with Colonel Jae-Soon Kong. The human commander looked tired, his uniform wrinkled and his face marked by the stress of command, but his eyes were steady, determined. Colonel Kang Vexel's voice echoed through the station's speakers. "You are outnumbered 50 to 1. Surrender now, and your people will be treated according to the Galactic Convention." Kong's response was immediate. "Commander Vextel, I've heard about you. Heard you're a warrior of honor. Then you'll understand why we can't surrender." Behind the colonel, Vextel could see the frantic activity of the evacuation. Families running with children in their arms, elderly being helped. Onto transport ships, medical personnel carrying patients on stretchers. It was chaos, but organized chaos, the kind that only came from desperate people working together. "We're not asking for mercy," Kong continued, his voice calm despite the situation. "We're buying time. Every minute we hold out, another transport gets away. That's our mission. That's our purpose." Lieutenant Eugene Choi hunched over the tactical display in the station's command center, her fingers dancing across the controls. Around her, the mixed garrison of humans and Catherian defectors, prepared for battle. The defectors, soldiers who had switched sides after witnessing human courage, worked alongside their former enemies with grim determination. "Sir, they're moving into assault formation," Choi reported. "First wave will hit in 10 minutes, acknowledged." Kong replied, his voice carrying across the command center. "Signal all units. Protocol 7 is now in effect." The words sent a chill through the station. Protocol 7 was a human military doctrine that prioritized civilian evacuation over everything else. It meant the station would fight to the last soldier, with no possibility of retreat or surrender. Everyone who stayed behind knew they were going to die. 18 hours, Kong announced over the station's communication system. That's how long we need to hold them off. 18 hours for the evacuation fleet to reach the jump point. Are you with me? The response came back from every section of the station. Human voices. Cytherian voices. Even a few Centauri who had been visiting the station when the attack began. They were all in this together now. The battle began with a coordinated assault on the station's defensive platforms. Cytherian fighters swarmed the outer hull like angry insects, their plasma cannons lighting up the darkness. Boarding pods launched. From the capital ships, each one carrying 50 heavily armed Marines, the station's automated defenses responded immediately. Turret batteries opened fire, filling space with streams of energy. Defensive drones launched from hidden bays, gauging the enemy fighters in deadly dogfights among the station's superstructure, but there were too many of them. The Cytherian forces crashed through the outer defenses like a wave breaking against a seawall. Boarding pods slammed into the station's hull, their occupants cutting through the metal with industrial plasma torches. Sergeant Minesio Kim held the eastern docking bay with 12 soldiers against 200 Cytherian Marines. She had been a schoolteacher before the war, but 3 years of fighting had turned her into a veteran. Her squad included a mix of humans and defectors, all of them knowing this was their last battle. "Here they come," she called out as the first Cytherian troops poured through the breach. A rifle bucked in her hands as she fired controlled bursts into the advancing enemy. Around her, her soldiers did the same, their weapons creating a wall of deadly fire. But the enemy kept coming. When their heavy weapons failed, they fought with small arms. When their ammunition ran low, they used mining charges scavenged from the station's industrial section. When the charges were gone, they fought with knives and bare hands. "Fall back to secondary positions," Colonel Kong ordered over the comm system. "Negative, sir," Kim replied, firing her last magazine into the advancing enemy, to many of them. "We hold here or they break through to the evacuation bays." Private Hyenwoo Park stood beside her, barely 18, and on his first deployment. His rifle was empty, but he held a plasma grenade in each hand. His face was pale with fear, but the voice was steady. "For the children, Sergeant." "For the children," she confirmed. "They died standing, both of them. But they held the line for another hour, giving the evacuation fleet precious time to load more civilians." Throughout the station, similar scenes played out. Engineer Sangmin Lee kept the power systems running even as Cytherian plasma fire melted. The conduits around him, communications officer Yoon Hae Moon, maintained contact with the evacuation fleet until the command center was overrun. Dr. Barua Yoon treated wounded soldiers in the medical bay, refusing evacuation until the last patient was stable. Sir Vextel, tactical officer, reported, "We've reached the command center. Resistance has ceased." But when the Cytherian forces breached the final blast doors, they found something unprecedented. Colonel Kang sat at his command console, mortally wounded but still alive. Round him, the station's automated systems continued to function, following the last orders. He had programmed status report, Vextel demanded, as he entered the command center. "All evacuation ships have cleared the system," Kong whispered, blood flecking his lips. "Mission accomplished," Colonel Vextel said, surprising himself with the respect in his voice. "Why didn't you surrender? You could have negotiated terms. Saved your people." Kong's eyes met his. "'Cause those weren't my people on the transports. They were children. Human children, Cytherian children, Centauri children. When you're defending kids, there are no terms. There's only duty." Colonel died 30 seconds later. But the station's automated systems continued to operate for another 3 hours. Following the protocols he had programmed, even in death, the humans continued to fight. "We took the station," Vexel told the recruits. "But we lost something. That day, we lost the certainty that we were fighting enemies. 'Cause who fights like that? Who dies like that? It's only people who believe in something greater than themselves." The war didn't end with explosions or grand speeches. It ended with whispers in military barracks, with soldiers questioning orders, with veterans like Vextel walking away from the only life they had ever known. The human resistance had done something no army could. They had planted seeds of doubt that grew into understanding. It started small. A Catharian medic who began treating prisoners with the same care he would show his own kind, remembering Dr. Ji Woo Song's compassion. Squad leader who refused orders to fire on civilian evacuation ships, thinking of Captain Hansel Kim's. Sacrifice. A fleet commander who delayed an assault to allow enemy wounded to be evacuated. Haunted by the memory of Omega Station, the changes spread through the Catharian military like wildfire. Soldiers who had witnessed human courage began to question what they were fighting for. Officers who had seen human sacrifice started to wonder if conquest was worth the cost. The rigid discipline that had held the Empire together for centuries began to crack. Vextel finished his drink and looked around the table at the young recruits. Their faces had transformed during his telling. The cocky swagger they had worn like armor was gone, replaced by something deeper and more complex. The Zephyrian lieutenant's wings hung still against his back. The Centauri's forearms rested quietly on the table. The Hegemony twins leaned forward, their eyes wide with understanding. "You asked about humans," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 10 years of war. "You wanted to know what you were dealing with? Here's what I learned. Humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy. Hell, a Centauri can lift 3 times what a human can. They're not the smartest. The Zephyrians have them beat there. They don't have the best technology or the most advanced tactics." He paused, his claws tracing intricate patterns on the table's scarred surface. Around them, the cantina had grown quieter, as if other patrons sensed the gravity of what was being shared. "But they have something we never understood," he continued. "Something that makes them more dangerous than any weapon, more powerful than any fleet. They fight not for glory or conquest, but for each other. They die not for their leaders or their empires, but for strangers they've never met. They'll sacrifice everything, their homes, their lives, their futures, to protect something they believe in." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Finally, Private Zendos, the young Centauri, found his voice. "You regret fighting against them?" Vextel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the depths of his empty mug. When he spoke, his voice carried a pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "I regret that it took a war to teach us what it means to be truly alive. I regret that we had to spill blood, human blood, Catharian blood, the blood of innocence, to learn about honor, and most of all, I regret that some of you will have to see what I've seen before you understand." He stood up slowly, his old joints creaking like the hull of an aging starship. The recruits watched him with new respect, seeing not just a battle-scarred veteran, but someone who had been fundamentally changed by his experiences. "The humans have a saying," he said, pulling on his weathered coat. "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. In 10 years of war, I never once saw a human do nothing. When faced with impossible odds, they fought. When confronted with suffering, they helped. When asked to choose between safety and sacrifice, they always chose sacrifice." He moved toward the cantina's exit, then stopped. The recruits waited, sensing he had more to say. "That's their strength," he continued. "That's their weakness. That's what makes them human. After 10 years of fighting them, I can tell you this. They changed us more than we ever changed them." As the recruits began to file out, their conversations subdued and thoughtful, Lieutenant Sokar, a hegemony officer with traditional blue skin markings, lingered behind. He approached Vextel with obvious hesitation. "Commander, one more question. Are the humans, are they really as dangerous as everyone says?" Vexel's mandibles clicked in what might have been a smile, though it held no humor. "Dangerous? Yes, youngster, but not in the way you think. They're not dangerous because of their weapons or their ships or their tactics. They're dangerous because they make you want to be better than you are." He paused, looking out through the cantina's viewport at the ships docking and departing from Nexus Station. Human vessels moved among alien craft, their crews working alongside former enemies in the vast dance of interstellar commerce. "They're dangerous because they show you what you could become," he continued. "After you've fought beside a human, After you've seen them die for something greater than themselves, you can never go back to being what you were before. They plant something inside you, hope, maybe, or conscience. And once it's there, it grows. He walked toward the exit then, paused one final time. The most dangerous thing about humans isn't their courage or their determination. It's that they make you believe in hope. And hope, younglings, is the most dangerous thing in the universe. Because once you have it, you can never truly give up. The old warrior disappeared into the crowds of Nexus Station, leaving behind a table of recruits who suddenly understood that their upcoming deployment would change them forever. They would leave as soldiers of their respective empires. But they would return as something else entirely, beings who had glimpsed what it meant to fight for something greater than conquest. In the months that followed, Vextel's story spread beyond that single cantina table. Other veterans began sharing their own experiences, adding their voices to a growing chorus of change. The rigid military hierarchies that had defined galactic politics for millennia began to evolve. The Catherian Empire reformed its military doctrine, emphasizing protection of civilians over territorial expansion. The Centauri Republic established new protocols for prisoner treatment and refugee protection. The hegemony created the first interspecies humanitarian corps, staffed by veterans from all sides of the conflict. On distant worlds, former enemies worked together to rebuild what war had destroyed. Human medical teams trained alien doctors in advanced trauma techniques. Catherian engineers helped design more efficient life support systems for mixed-species crews. Centauri agricultural specialists shared crop rotation methods that could feed populations on hostile worlds. The changes weren't universal or immediate. Some corners of the galaxy still harbored the old hatreds, the old prejudices. But something fundamental had shifted in the collective consciousness of the spacefaring races. They had seen what humans were capable of, and more importantly, they had seen what they themselves could become when inspired by that example. Years later, when historians tried to pinpoint the moment the human wars truly ended, they couldn't identify a single battle or treaty. Instead, they found thousands of small moments. A Catherian medic treating human prisoners with compassion. Centauri pilot risking his life to evacuate civilians. A hegemony commander choosing mercy over victory. And in a cantina on Nexus Station. An old warrior's tales continued to echo through the years, reminding everyone who heard them that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from understanding. That sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who shows you what you could become. The galaxy was still vast and often cruel, still home to conflict and suffering. But now it was also something else, a place where hope had taken root, planted by the courage of humans who refused to surrender there. Compassion even in the face of war. The end.